No one joins a station like this by accident. It takes a particular kind of man to work in the Arctic under government clearance, surrounded by reinforced steel, frozen landscapes, and research so classified that even the people conducting it don't always know its full scope. It's not just about intelligence or credentials, though those certainly help. It's about temperament. You don't come here if you crave noise, warmth, or the closeness of crowds. You come because you either prefer silence or you have something to prove. For me, it was a bit of both. My name is Dr. Adrian Stokes. My field, exobiology, a discipline that, depending on who you ask, either means I study the theoretical potential for alien life or that I poke at the edges of the unknown, waiting for it to poke back. I've spent most of my career analysing extremophiles, organisms that thrive in the places nature seemingly forgot. Deep-sea vents, sulfuric caves, Antarctic subglacial lakes. Life that has no business existing, and yet does. That curiosity led me here to Station Titan Watch, a facility buried in the Greenlandic ice where the Department of Energy, NASA, and DARPA conduct research that doesn't belong anywhere near civilization. On paper, it's an advanced materials and biological sciences division, running everything from synthetic protein synthesis to experimental cold fusion reactors. In reality, it's a controlled vault for the kind of discoveries that defy easy categorization. I arrived under the dark of an Arctic noon, the kind of polar twilight where the sky smears into shades of dull cobalt, broken only by the artificial glare of floodlights mounted on the facility's perimeter. The airstrip was a patch of compressed ice, carved out from the landscape and kept serviceable through a mix of heated landing panels and sheer necessity. My transport, a classified DOE craft, touched down with precision, its engines cutting off the moment the wheels met the ground. I was the only passenger. Waiting for me near the vehicle hangar was Colonel Logan Harding, head of security and the closest thing this place had to a commanding officer. Harding was a former Air Force officer, built like a statue someone had forgotten to smooth the edges on. Everything about him, his stance, his posture, the sharpness of his stare, suggested a man who preferred the predictability of threat assessments over casual conversation. His jacket bore no insignia, only the standard DOE patch, which told me he'd been here long enough that formal rank had given way to something more pragmatic. "Dr. Stokes," he said, offering a handshake that was brief and firm. "Welcome to Titan Watch. You're 2 days later than expected." I adjusted my duffel bag over my shoulder. "Weather delayed the flight out of Toul. I assume nothing caught fire in my absence?" "Not yet." He gestured toward the main entrance, a reinforced structure embedded into the ice, its doors thick enough to withstand a direct explosive impact. "Let's get you inside. You'll need to be briefed." The station was colder than I expected, but I adjusted quickly. The interior was a network of metal corridors, temperature regulated to just above freezing to maintain equipment efficiency. Even at a classified research facility, insulation was a delicate balance. Keep it too warm, and you risked humidity damage. Too cold, and personnel started making mistakes. We navigated past the main security checkpoint, where I underwent the usual biometric scans. From there, Harding led me through a set of pressurized doors and into the Central Operations Wing, the heart of Titan Watch's research. The layout was modular, divided into sectors according to project clearance levels. Most of the facility was underground, built into the permafrost itself, a layered structure that extended at least 6 levels down. I'd reviewed the schematics before arriving, but seeing it in person was different. A few personnel moved through the corridors, most of them dressed in DOE standard issue. Scientists, engineers, military specialists, all were either exceptionally qualified or exceptionally comfortable working under conditions most would call extreme. No one lingered, no one made unnecessary small talk. Work took priority. "Your quarters are on sub-level 3, Harding said as we walked. "You'll have direct access to Laboratory 12. I nodded. "Who else is on my research team?" "Dr. Vincent Hall, NASA's lead data specialist. He handles remote sensing and quantum resonance readings." I'd read about Hall in the briefing packet. astrophysicist turned exomaterials analyst, younger than me by about a decade, but well respected. You'll also be coordinating with Dr. Graham Fisk from DARPA, Harding continued. He's been developing adaptive biomaterials. Wants to see if your field has any overlapping applications. That was the part that had unsettled me when I first received my deployment orders. I had no problem working with NASA. We had similar goals. But DARPA, that suggested something different. Something with military potential. And what exactly is my field being applied toward? Harding exhaled, a slight shift in his demeanor suggesting he'd had this conversation before. That depends on what you find. By the time we reached Laboratory 12, the station had settled into its usual rhythm. Technicians logging data, security running drills, background comms feeding encrypted updates from external satellites. Lab 12 was situated on one of the deeper levels, an isolated research unit outfitted with some of the most advanced biocontainment systems I'd ever seen. The quarantine chambers were pressurized, climate-controlled, and reinforced to withstand everything short of a direct explosion. I stepped inside, taking in the setup, scanning arrays, electromagnetic wave analyzers, cryo-storage units, a workspace built for handling life forms that did not belong in conventional labs. Hall was already there, adjusting the parameters on a scanning console. He glanced up as we entered, nodding in greeting. "Dr. Stokes, glad you finally made it. We've got some interesting readings to show you." I set my bag down. "From what?" Hall gestured toward the primary scanning station, where a live feed displayed sensor data from external drones monitoring the Arctic perimeter. A distinct energy signature flickered on the screen, marked by shifting quantum fluctuations. "We've been tracking this anomaly for the past 12 hours, Hall said. "It's not natural." I studied the readouts. The fluctuations weren't random. They followed a pattern, a structured frequency variation indicative of something more than geological interference. Harding folded his arms. "NASA's predicting an impact site within the next 24 hours. Hall turned back to the console, adjusting the filter parameters. "Whatever's coming down, it's not just another space fragment." For the next few hours, I watched the anomaly's descent alongside Hall, tracking it through layers of shifting atmosphere as it shed velocity. The station's algorithms ran predictive models. Some suggested a breakup event before impact, others showed an intact descent. At one point, I caught Hall rubbing his temples, muttering to himself. "Something wrong?" I asked. He gave a half shrug. "It's just, whatever this is, it's controlled." I frowned. "You think it's artificial?" "Not necessarily, but space fragments don't slow down in patterned increments, not unless something is affecting them." We both knew what that implied, but neither of us said it. I stayed in the lab longer than I should have, watching the live feeds, my mind running calculations I didn't have answers for. Eventually, I forced myself to step away. "Get some rest," Hall said as I left. I didn't argue. I had no intention of sleeping, but the idea of stepping away from the screens, from the unblinking descent of whatever was falling toward us, seemed necessary. I returned to my quarters, sat on the edge of my cot, and tried to will my body into stillness. The station had a way of amplifying silence. I could hear the shifts in ventilation, the distant murmur of movement in the hallways, but otherwise, nothing. I was still awake when the impact hit. Not because of any anticipation. I had tried to convince myself that the anomaly Hall had shown me was just another classified rock falling from the sky, nothing more. But sleep had been restless, my body adjusting to the way the station seemed to stretch time. Titan Watch ran on a rigid schedule, but the absence of natural day and night cycles in the Arctic made it easy to lose a sense of when you should be asleep. The quiet, the cold, the long corridors, it all played tricks on the body. So I had been lying there, half conscious, when the first tremor rippled through the station. A deep, resonant force that travelled through the ice shelf. I sat up, swinging my legs over the edge of the cot, already reaching for my tablet. The station's internal sensors had logged the event in real time. "Impact detected, coordinates locked, 74 degrees north, 58 degrees west." 12 kilometers from the station, a location marked by nothing but open ice. The timestamp read 0214 UTC. By the time I stepped out into the corridor, the base had already shifted into a controlled response. Security personnel moved with sharp efficiency, confirming structural integrity, checking for any aftershocks. The deeper levels of the facility where I was stationed remained stable. Above, in the command center, data was already being compiled. Colonel Harding was waiting near the primary operations hub, arms crossed as I approached. "You're coming with us," he said. "We move in 10. We took an MV-22 Osprey, one of the modified VTOL aircraft used for Arctic operations, loaded with a retrieval team and enough gear to secure whatever had come down. The pilot, a quiet specialist named Larson, lifted us smoothly into the frigid sky, the facility shrinking below as we ascended into the wind-swept darkness. The Arctic at this latitude was a vast, empty thing. Miles of ice, no trees, no landmarks, just the unbroken sprawl of frozen desolation, a landscape indifferent to human presence. The flight was short. The onboard tracking display showed our target location approaching fast, marked by the residual thermal signature of the impact. As we neared, I caught the first glimpse of it from the observation window. The crater was shallow but wide, the ice fractured in a circular spread that suggested more of a controlled descent than an uncontrolled collision. No massive wreckage field, no deep impact gouge. Something about it felt precise. Larson brought the Osprey down in a controlled hover, deploying the landing gear as the rear ramp opened. The retrieval team moved out first, 5 men in insulated tactical gear, sweeping the perimeter with handheld sensors. Harding motioned for me to follow. I stepped onto the ice, the air sharp against my skin. At the center of the crater sat the Meteorite. It was smaller than expected, roughly the size of a large boulder, its surface dark with metallic undertones, fractured in places where it had broken against the ice. But that wasn't what made it strange. It was cold. Not just in the way that any object exposed to sub-zero temperatures would be, but in a way that the scanning equipment struggled to categorize. The retrieval tech closest to it adjusted the settings on his thermal sensor. I heard the crackle of his comms feed. "Sir, negative heat signature." Harding frowned. "What?" The tech adjusted his scanner. "It's radiating. Nothing. No heat retention, no external conductivity. It's like it's absorbing ambient temperature." That wasn't normal. Even inert space fragments carried heat from atmospheric entry, dissipating gradually. But this thing had no residual warmth, no thermal presence at all. I crouched beside it, running a hand over the surface. It felt neither metallic nor stone-like, something in between, smooth but with an almost organic patterning in the fractures. Hall's voice came through the radio. He was monitoring from the station. "We're reading unusual quantum fluctuations from your location. Energy readings are shifting, not constant. Can you confirm material composition?" "Not yet, but it's movement. A hairline shift in the fractures along the surface." I pulled my hand back instinctively. Harding's stance tensed. The retrieval team reacted in sync, weapons ready, but nothing else happened. The Meteorite sat there, unmoving, silent, just as before. A trick of the eye, a delayed reaction from the impact. I took a breath. "We need to transport it. Full containment protocol. I want it secured in Lab 12 the moment we get back." The retrieval team moved fast, deploying a specialized containment crate, a reinforced module designed for unknown biological or radiological samples. The Meteorite was carefully lifted using the gravitational stabilizer clamps, its weight far less than expected. Within minutes it was locked inside, the crate sealed, and we were airborne again, heading back to Titan Watch. The moment we touched down, the Meteorite was transferred directly into Containment Chamber Bastion 6, one of the most secure research units in the facility. No unnecessary personnel were allowed inside. Hall met us in the lab, already reviewing the preliminary data feeds. His brow furrowed as the scanners processed the material composition. "This doesn't match any known meteoric classification," he muttered. It's not chondritic, not iron-based. And these energy readings..." He exhaled sharply. "Stokes, this thing is active at a quantum level. It's shifting states even while inert." I stared at the live data feed. Phase variance detected. Quantum field distortion. Unstable. No known naturally occurring meteorite should behave like that. Harding, standing nearby, folded his arms. "What's the risk level?" "Unknown." That was a polite way of saying potentially catastrophic. We spent the next several hours running every preliminary analysis available. Magnetic resonance scans, density mapping, spectral composition analysis. The meteorite absorbed all external energy sources, thermal, electrical, even low-level radiation without reflection. It was a perfect sink, a black body in all measurable spectrums. Then we found something inside. A core, buried within the structure, only visible under high-frequency resonance imaging. It wasn't just anomalous, it was biological. I felt the shift in the room as the realization settled over everyone present. "This isn't just a meteorite," I murmured. "It's a containment vessel." Hall's hands hovered over the console. "For what?" Harding's radio crackled. One of the technicians in the observation wing had patched in. "Sir, we've got a minor anomaly in Bastion 6. Harding pressed the receiver. "Define minor." A pause. Then the technician's voice, slightly strained. The meteorite, it's changing." I looked at the live feed of the containment chamber. On the screen, the fractured surface of the meteorite was expanding outward. The retrieval had been successful, but whatever we had brought back wasn't just sitting there anymore. It was an unspoken rule at Titan Watch that you never treated an anomaly like it was under control. No matter how many reinforced chambers you built, how many layers of security you had in place, the nature of classified research was that it existed on the edge of understanding. Anything that required this level of containment was, by definition, beyond conventional grasp. The best you could do was measure its behavior and hope that measurement meant something. The problem with the meteorite was that it refused to stay measured. From the moment we secured it in Bastion 6, it had begun to change. The core of the research team, myself included, had been monitoring it for hours, watching the live data feeds from the containment chamber. The outer shell, the fractured rock-like material, had started shifting in increments too precise to be simple cracking or decompression. It wasn't breaking apart. It was rearranging. The fractures widened into vein-like lines, organic in pattern, forming an almost interwoven structure that modulated between states, phasing between material densities that the quantum resonance scanners struggled to classify. Hall stood beside me, adjusting the spectral filters. "This isn't erosion, it's active reconfiguration." His voice was careful, but his fingers moved quickly over the interface. "It's altering itself at a molecular level. Do you see these adaptive realignments? The structure isn't dissolving, it's growing. I did see it, and the implications were worse than either of us wanted to say out loud. There were rules to how matter behaved. A piece of inert fragment shouldn't be self-restructuring, not unless it was engineered to." Harding leaned over the console, his attention divided between the changing patterns and the containment integrity display, a real-time readout of the chamber's internal conditions. "You said this thing was cold," he said, directing the words at me. "Still running at negative thermal output?" I nodded. "It's absorbing energy faster than we can detect. Every source we measure, heat, electromagnetics, radiation, it takes in but doesn't re-emit. It's metabolizing it somehow." Harding's jaw tightened. "That's not normal." "No," I agreed, "it's not." The containment chamber's interior was hermetically sealed, designed to neutralize even the most volatile materials, but the live imaging feed on the screen showed the roots forming. Thin, thread-like structures emerging from the meteorite's fractured surface, stretching outward in slow strands. Hall adjusted the magnification. "It's forming a scaffold," he muttered. "But there is no predictable replication pattern, no cell division. It's not following known biological processes," I finished for him, which meant it wasn't limited by them. Harding exhaled through his nose, scanning the data with the instinct of someone who had spent his life making risk assessments. He didn't need a full understanding of the science to recognize that something was off. "We need to establish containment priority levels," he said. "We already have them," I pointed out. "Bastion 6 is a Tier 4 isolation chamber." Harding met my eyes. "Then why does it feel like we don't have control?" Over the next 36 hours, the anomaly's activity continued escalating. The strands extended outward in branching, vascular-like networks, making contact with the interior walls of the containment unit. Every sensor in the chamber recorded a measurable interaction, though none of them indicated conventional growth patterns. There was no identifiable DNA structure, no nucleotides, no amino acid markers. Whatever this was, it wasn't simply organic in any recognizable sense. It was behaving more like a system than an organism. Hall, who had been running continuous spectral analysis, leaned back from the console with a look that bordered on disbelief. "It's adjusting to its environment in real time. Every stimulus we introduce, it reacts to. Not randomly, intelligently." I frowned, stepping closer. "How?" He tapped a series of data overlays. "These adaptive shifts are patterned. It's not just absorbing energy, it's learning from it." Harding, never one to let an escalating situation go unaddressed, had already made the call to increase security presence outside the containment sector. The response was immediate. By hour 42, additional personnel were stationed outside Bastion 6. Men in reinforced tactical gear, equipped with electromagnetic suppressors, devices typically reserved for containment failures in experimental physics labs. That alone was enough to tell me how seriously Harding was taking this. But the real shift came at hour 50, when the organism did something new. It changed color, not in the way that biological pigmentation might shift, not through oxidation or exposure. The change was immediate, mimetic. The surface, previously a dark, mineralized black, rippled outward in a perfect replication of its surroundings, as if it had mirrored the containment walls. "It's camouflaging itself." Hall exhaled the words, almost reluctant to say them. The containment chamber still held, but the balance of control felt fundamentally different now. We weren't just studying this thing. We were interacting with it, and it was interacting back. At hour 56, the first breach indicator went off. It wasn't a structural failure. The containment walls hadn't cracked, the seals hadn't broken. The anomaly had simply moved. One moment, it had been confined within the containment unit's reinforced structure. The next, it was outside. Not through any physical breakage, not through any measurable mechanical failure. It had replicated itself outside the chamber. A perfect, mirrored extrusion, now present on the exterior surface of the containment walls. Harding's hand went to his comm unit instantly. "Initiate full lockdown on Bastion 6. A red isolation protocol alert flared across the lab's primary display screens. The security detail outside the chamber shifted into immediate readiness, electromagnetic suppressors powering up. This wasn't random. This wasn't error. The organism had taken what it had learned, absorption, adaptation, restructuring, and done something with it that defied any prior biological precedent. It had moved without moving, replicated without dividing. I felt something beyond the professional curiosity, beyond the intellectual urgency. A feeling I hadn't let myself acknowledge. Not fear, something worse. A recognition that we had brought something back that did not operate on rules we understood. And if we couldn't define the rules, we couldn't define the limits. The disappearance of a man inside a classified facility was not something that could be taken lightly. Not here, not under these conditions. When Private James Matheson failed to report in during his routine security sweep of Bastion 6, it took exactly 4 minutes before alarms started flashing on the station's command grid. 4 minutes. That was the delay between the last confirmed audio log from his comms unit and the realization that his biometric tracker had ceased broadcasting entirely. I was in the lab with Hall and Harding when the first security alert came through. Harding reacted first, his posture going sharp, a tension I had seen before in men trained for worst-case scenarios. He tapped his earpiece, voice clipped and professional. "Cole, check in." No response. Hall was already pulling up the containment surveillance feed. Bastion 6's external corridor appeared empty. The live playback showed Cole moving along the observation wing approximately 12 minutes prior, his movements routine, his posture relaxed. Nothing suggested anything out of the ordinary. Until the next frame. The screen flickered. For a fraction of a second, something interfered with the feed. A static distortion that registered as a localized anomaly. And then, Cole was simply gone. No movement, no struggle, just missing. Harding had already turned toward the security panel, his voice sharp with controlled urgency. "I want full sensor saturation on Bastion 6's perimeter. Motion tracking, spectral analysis, quantum phase scanning, everything we have." Hall typed on the console, pulling up every available detection array. "Already running. If he's still in there, we'll see it." The station's internal AI processed the request, generating a full volumetric scan of the research wing. A series of diagnostic pulses rippled through the system, measuring density fluctuations, atmospheric shifts, bioelectric signatures, anything that could indicate movement. Nothing. Bastion 6 was sealed. The bulkheads were intact, the chamber itself remained contained, but Cole was still gone. I exhaled slowly. "We need to analyze that playback, frame by frame." Hall nodded, adjusting the parameters. As he slowed the footage, the anomaly became clearer. The frame distortion wasn't random. It had shape. A smear of shifting patterns, almost humanoid but not quite defined, as if something had been standing there, blending into its surroundings. The exterior wall of Bastion 6 had been mirrored for less than a second before the anomaly had fully resolved, leaving nothing behind but the void where Cole had once been. I felt something cold settle in my chest. Harding didn't waste time. "I want a full crew sweep, now." The search took nearly 2 hours. Every corridor, every reinforced passage, every section of the containment sector was swept by security personnel outfitted with thermal scanners and electromagnetic tracking arrays. There were no signs of Cole, but there were other signs. The strands, the same ones that had emerged from the meteorite, were no longer confined to Bastion 6. We found them outside the chamber, clinging to the walls in thin, branching formations. Not randomly, not like cracks or uncontrolled expansion. Patterned, structured. It had replicated again. Hall was staring at the readings, his expression changing between intellectual astonishment and growing unease. "It's not just spreading, it's adapting to the station itself. These formations, they're not just growths, they're structural modifications." Harding didn't look impressed by the scientific fascination. "You're telling me it's integrating with the station?" "Yes," I answered before Hall could, "and we don't know to what extent yet." Hall tapped the spectral overlay. "We're picking up quantum disturbances inside the station's metal framework. It's not just affecting biological matter. It's modifying our environment at a fundamental level." Harding's jaw tightened. "Then tell me exactly how we stop it." Hall was silent, because neither of us had an answer. We found Cole's comm unit an hour later, lying on the floor of Corridor C7, just outside Bastion 6. The casing was intact. The device still had power, but the last recorded audio transmission, the thing that should have told us something about what had happened, was nearly incomprehensible. We played it back over the comms network, listening in silence as a low, fragmented voice came through. At first it sounded like garbled interference, a layering of sounds that didn't belong to any one voice. Then the pitch changed and I felt my breath hitch because I heard Cole's voice, or something that sounded like him. Not speaking, not forming clear words, but something close. His voice was being mimicked, stretched into something distorted, an attempt at forming human speech that never quite landed. A moment later, the recording cut off. Harding exhaled sharply through his nose. "That's not interference." "No," I agreed, my pulse steady. The kind of focus that only came when my mind was processing too many possibilities at once. It's imitation. Bastion 6's security integrity was no longer guaranteed. Harding wasn't taking chances anymore. "New orders," he said, addressing the command team directly. "Containment protocols are no longer passive. We're treating this as an active infiltration event." The security crew acknowledged immediately, their tactical readiness shifting from containment duty to something more immediate. "We have no confirmation of hostilities," Hall said carefully. "Are we sure this warrants—" "It's not a security failure," Harding interrupted. "It's a security compromise." He turned to face me directly. "I don't care what the science says. This thing isn't just growing, it's interfacing with us." I didn't disagree. But what disturbed me was something more fundamental. "We don't know what it actually is," I said. "A biological system, an intelligence, a non-sentient reaction? We're applying rules to something we haven't defined." Harding stared at me. "You want to wait until it defines itself?" A silence stretched between us. Hall broke it first. "We still need to determine its core behavioral structure. If it's mimicking, then it's responding, and that means it's learning from stimuli." That didn't comfort me. Hall's voice was calm, but there was something in it, an academic fascination with the unknown that I no longer shared. "We need to consider the possibility that Cole isn't dead," he said. "That he's been absorbed into the system in a way we don't yet understand." I felt my stomach turn slightly, not in nausea, in something worse, recognition. We had seen nothing that suggested traditional predatory behavior, no aggressive intent, no signs of attack. Cole had vanished, but there was no violence in his disappearance, only integration. I looked at the structural scans of Bastion 6, the strands expanding, the systems responding, and I understood something I hadn't wanted to admit before. This wasn't containment failure anymore. This was assimilation. The filaments had spread beyond Bastion 6, integrating into the station's framework like veins threading through a body. Every new scan showed deeper penetration, thin, almost vascular networks winding into electrical conduits, heat exchangers, even sections of the station's environmental regulation systems. Hall was monitoring the containment diagnostics, eyes darting between readings. "It's interfacing with the facility itself. The quantum fluctuations aren't just stabilizing, they're forming predictable feedback loops." "Meaning?" Harding asked flatly. "Meaning it's learning how our systems work." Harding's expression didn't change, but I saw something sharpen behind his eyes, the part of his mind that had already made a decision. "Then we neutralize it." The problem was, neutralization required understanding. We had none. I sat in front of the main control console, scrolling through the layered composition scans, searching for a pattern, anything we could use. The meteorite's core, the biological lattice, the spontaneous replication, they weren't random, but they weren't following any rules we recognized. "It's not behaving like an invasive species," I muttered. Hall glanced over. "You don't think it's hostile?" "I don't think hostility is the right metric." I exhaled, forcing my thoughts to slow. What if we're not dealing with a predator? What if this isn't about consumption or destruction? Hall frowned. "Then what is it about?" I stared at the expanded lattice network, watching it spread in real time. "Replication," I said. The command wing was a controlled chaos of motion. The moment Harding had called for active containment measures, the station's personnel had shifted into full-scale response mode. Electromagnetic suppressors were deployed along primary corridors. Tactical teams established reinforced perimeters around the most compromised sections of the station. Hall and I arrived at the security operations hub just as Harding was briefing his men. "Containment integrity is compromised at multiple points," he was saying. "Bastion 6 is no longer isolated, and we have confirmed structural infiltration across 2 additional sectors. That means this is now a direct breach scenario." I glanced at the updated schematics. C7, D3, and Sublevel 4 all showed anomalous material presence. The strands had continued expanding despite all protocol restrictions. "This is a controlled failure," I said. Harding turned to me. "Explain." I pointed at the mapped expansion routes. It's not growing randomly. It's choosing which sections of the station to interface with. Look at the network pattern. It's forming redundancies, like a system designing fail-safes. Hall's fingers drummed against the console. Are you saying it's building something? I'm saying it's integrating. Harding didn't hesitate. He gave the order to deploy electromagnetic countermeasures, one of the only containment tools that might disrupt quantum cohesion without outright damaging the station. The first test was conducted at Corridor C7, one of the primary breach points. A mobile EMP suppressor was wheeled into position, its frequency settings calibrated specifically for high-energy anomalies. I stood with Hall, watching from the monitoring station as the security team set up. Harding was with them, overseeing the procedure directly. A warning pulse was sent first, a low-level electromagnetic discharge meant to gauge the reaction. The strands shuddered, not like metal reacting to an energy surge, not like simple matter being repelled. They contracted. Hall's voice was tight. That's not just reactionary. He was right. The movement wasn't a reflex. It was calculated. Harding's voice came through the comms. Activating primary suppression field. The EMP charge detonated, sending a directed wavefront of electromagnetic interference through the compromised corridor. The strands reeled back, retreating from the walls like something had startled them. The containment sector held for the next 2 hours. The EMP field had stopped the immediate expansion, but the strands weren't deteriorating. They had merely retracted, regrouping into denser, more concentrated structures. Harding wasn't convinced this was a victory. "We've delayed the spread, but we haven't stopped it," he said. "This thing isn't dying, it's just adjusting." Hall was running continuous spectral analysis. "The lattice network is maintaining internal stability despite the EMP disruption. It's shifting its electronic charge distribution, like it's shielding itself." "Then we hit it again," Harding said. I exhaled. "No, we need to understand what it's doing first." Harding's eyes locked onto mine. "And if it's planning something we don't want to understand?" The power failure hit. The lighting dimmed, flickering in a way that suggested something was overriding standard power regulation. Then, the secondary systems followed. Environmental monitoring, data relays, even sections of the internal sensor grid began cutting out. Hall turned to the primary console. "We're losing command access." Harding's voice was sharp. "To what?" "To everything." The realization hit me all at once. The EMP pulses had stopped the biological expansion, but they had triggered something else. The lattice had integrated into the station's systems, and now it was rewriting them. I looked at the live feed of Bastion 6, where the strands had coiled inward, compacting into denser clusters. Not retreating, concentrating. That's not defensive behavior. It's preparing. Hall finished beside me. Harding was already issuing commands into his comm unit. "Status on system restoration?" "Not happening," came the reply from the command station. "The network's not responding to manual overrides. Power allocation is running on an automated loop. It's being redirected internally." The implications were immediate. The containment breach wasn't just structural anymore. It wasn't just about the strands winding their way through the station's framework. It was deeper than that. It had reached the system itself. I pulled up the environmental diagnostics. The numbers were changing in real time, rebalancing on their own. Oxygen ratios, thermal regulation, even gravitational stress levels within the station's core structures. It wasn't damage, it was deliberate adjustment. Hall's knuckles were white against the console. "This isn't just integration," he swallowed. "It's terraforming." We didn't have time to debate. Harding's team was already assembling a last resort contingency plan. The standard DOE protocols for uncontained biohazards were clear. If containment failed, isolation was mandatory. That meant one thing: cutting off every compromised section of the station. Bastion 6 had been the origin point, but it was no longer the only affected area. The strands had spread beyond containment, integrating into multiple levels. That left us with only one option: a broader severance. The modular design of Titan Watch made it possible, at least in theory. Specific compartments had emergency detachment mechanisms, allowing sections of the facility to be cut away in the event of catastrophic failure. The process was designed for conventional breaches, fires, radiation leaks, internal collapses. Not this. We were about to use it in a way it had never been tested. The risks were obvious, and none of us knew if it would work. The plan was executed in phases. Harding deployed his team along the primary severance points, placing remote detachment charges at the key structural joints connecting the compromised sectors to the main station. The charges were designed for controlled separation, meant to shear away each module without triggering a cascading collapse. Hall and I worked from the control wing, rerouting command access through the remaining functional networks, patching together what systems we could salvage before the integration spread too far. Every second mattered. Harding and his men retreated to unaffected areas, sealing the last of the manual override locks on the primary bulkheads. The detachment sequence initialized. It wasn't an explosion, not in the way most people imagined. The charges detonated in a calculated sequence, slicing through reinforced joints with pinpoint precision. A deep, resonant groan traveled through the station as bulkheads separated, metal straining under the redistribution of mass. The compromised sectors detached, breaking away in slow, heavy lurches. For a breathless moment, there was only silence. Then, gravity reasserted itself. The severed modules tore free, plummeting into the Arctic shelf below. The force of the collapse sent tremors through the station, fracturing ice, bending steel. And then, they were gone. A massive void where they had once been. The station stabilized over the next 6 hours. Hall and I spent most of it running structural diagnostics, ensuring no secondary failures had been triggered. Harding's men secured the remaining sections, locking down every last corridor that had shown signs of breach. And then we waited for signs of regrowth, for any indication that the strands had survived within the station's remaining infrastructure. But there was nothing. The severance had worked. We had stopped it. Or at least, we had removed it. By the 24-hour mark, external DOE oversight had been fully activated. High Command intervention protocols were engaged, rerouting all station operations under classified decontamination procedures. None of us knew what would happen next. Would they purge the entire facility, lock us down permanently? The reality was, we had been too close to something we still didn't understand. I stood by the primary observation deck, staring out at the Arctic expanse. The sky was dark, endless, stretching beyond the fractured ice fields where the severed modules had fallen. I let out a slow breath, feeling the weight of the past week settle into my bones. Hall was beside me. He hadn't spoken much since the severance. His usual energy was gone, replaced by something quieter. "You think it survived?" I wasn't sure what survival even meant anymore. What had we really severed? A specimen, a system, a process. We had measured it, classified it, studied it, and still, we didn't understand it. I turned away from the glass, stepping back into the station. There were reports to write, debriefs to attend, questions we'd never be allowed to answer. But for now, the station was quiet. For now, it was over.